Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. Okay, this time we're gonna talk about Siberia and the Volga region. As I said before, the plan of the Entente was to land invasion troops into Arkhangelsk and join the White Guards who were waging revolts in the region surrounding Moscow. Thus, Moscow would be encircled and blockaded. However, a crucial part of this plan was the Czechoslovak Legion in Soviet Russia. The Entente knew that the White Guard rebellions in Yaroslavl, Kostroma and elsewhere didn't stand a chance unless they received help from imperialist troops. There were Czechoslovak military units inside Russia which wanted to be transported through Siberia to Vladivostok and then eventually on a ship to the front to fight against the Central Powers. The Bolsheviks had given them permission to travel to Vladivostok and then leave. However, the French officers who led these Czechoslovak units provoked a battle between them and the Bolshevik government. The imperialists deceived the Czechoslovaks by saying that the Bolsheviks were German agents, trying to arrest them and hand them to the Germans or Austrians. This is how they first got them to rebel against the Soviets. This lie was even perpetuated by the White-SRs in a book they published in 1930. Anti-communist writer Vera Broido, whose parents were Menshevik party members, continued to claim in her book from 1987 that the Bolsheviks wanted to hand the Czechoslovaks to the Germans under German orders. The British had already tried to create a similar puppet army from the Finnish emigrants, but that project had failed. The capitalist editor of the 1970s edition of Victor Serge's 1 Year of the Russian Revolution discusses in the postscript, with reference to official documents, the various Anglo-French plans to invade Russia and the use of the Savinkov organization and the Czechoslovaks and others. In May 1918, the Czechoslovak troops traveling on the Trans-Siberian Railway began attacking Bolshevik forces, overthrowing the Bolsheviks in numerous towns that they passed through, and helping the Whites, Right-SRs and Mensheviks set up reactionary governments. However, in the end, the imperialist forces still did not reach Yaroslavl, Kostroma, Rybinsk or other White Guard rebellions in time to provide assistance to them. The imperialists tried to fuel ethnic hatred between the Czechoslovaks and other nations. There was even an armed fight between the Czechoslovak units and Hungarian prisoners of war. However, there were also many Czechoslovak communists and others who did not want to be involved in this criminal venture. That is why the French officers who controlled the Czechoslovaks had to rely on deception and to lie to the soldiers. Social Democrat writer Price writes the following, quote, "The French military mission had laid its plans well. Just before the Czechoslovak Rising, it had paid out, through the French consul in Moscow, 11 million rubles to the Czechoslovak National Council, and the British consul in Moscow had paid out 80,000 pounds. The money was paid to members of the National Council, M. Sheep and M. Bogumil Chermak, and through their hands it went to the commanders of the Czechoslovak detachments in various parts of Russia. The minds of the Czechoslovak soldiers had been carefully prepared by propaganda from the French military mission to the effect that the Soviet government had refused to allow them to return to France and was about to deliver them over to the Austrian military authorities, who would hang them all as deserters. Like hunted animals at bay, the volunteers struck, and it was not an accident that the places where they happened to strike were along the lines of the Volga and the Siberian Railway, thus cutting off central Russia from its last corn reserve. It only required an Allied or anti-Soviet force on the shores of the White Sea to almost complete the ring, running from the far north to the North Caucasus and mouth of the Don." Unquote. Quote, "Documents which fell into the hands of the Soviet authorities when the Czechoslovak troops were evacuating Siberian towns in the following year prove that the leaders of these forces were heavily bribed by the representatives of Britain and France to act as they did." Unquote. According to an American writer who interviewed a Russian sailor, quote, "There were about 2,000 Czechoslovaks in jail in Siberia for refusing to fight the Bolsheviks." Unquote. Anti-communist historian Orlandlo Figes writes that, quote, "The Czech Legion was unwilling to fight in Russia indefinitely, its soldiers were tired and wanted to go home, and their morale declined further as the Reds became better organized. By the middle of August the Czech units were falling apart, some of the soldiers were socialists, and they went over to the Reds." Unquote. After White General Kolchak came to power in Siberia, quote, "The rank and file of the Czechoslovak legions now understood for what purposes they had been used. Many of them had from the first unwillingly taken part in the adventure and had been largely forced by their influential commander, Colonel Gaida. The latter had acted all through as their evil genius, and now that he was losing the confidence of his rank and file, he openly became one of Kolchak's generals. From this time forth, the Czechoslovak troops took no part in the operations against the Red Army and remained sullenly in the rear along the Siberian Railway, waiting for the first opportunity to return to Europe." Unquote. Figes further writes, quote, "The majority of the rank-and-file Czechs were alienated by the out-and-out monarchism of the military commanders in Samara and Ufa. Many began to doubt the support of the Entente powers for the Czech national cause. They questioned the whole purpose of their struggle against the Bolsheviks. The Legion began to disintegrate. Some deserted to the Red Army. Others became more interested in selling the Legion's vast quantities of military provisions to the surrounding population than in fighting the enemy." Unquote. According to White-SR writers, 18 of the quote-unquote most prominent socialists among the Czechoslovaks, by which they mean Czechoslovak social traders, opportunists, equivalent to the Russian Mensheviks, published the following statement in order to fool their troops into supporting the Whites. They say, quote, "Our mission is democratic. We, as socialists, assure you that our army will not and cannot be used for the purpose of counter-revolution. Rest assured that we fully sympathize with the following slogans the White Guard, Right-SR, and Menshevik government, known as the Komuch, or the Committee for the Organization of the Constituent Assembly, put forward: protection of civil liberties, security for labor and protection of trade unions, transfer of all lands to the people, preventing military dictatorship." Unquote. But despite these lies, which were intended to cover up the true character of the White Guards, the truth was soon revealed to the Czechoslovak troops because the Komuch government in question, the government set up by the SRs and Mensheviks and their allies, soon began taking land away from the peasants, thus reversing the land reform, began to crush worker organizations, carried out massacres and other violations of civil rights, and the main parties of the Komuch itself, the cadets and SRs, began supporting military dictatorship until finally a coup was carried out by monarchist White General Kolchak, who had been working in the Komuch as a minister. In the foreign press, the SRs and cadets continued to lie and claim that White generals Kolchak, Denikin, Yudenich, etc. were great Democrats, but nowadays we know that those were only lies. Quote, "The Czechoslovak commander-in-chief, General Serivoy, had no delusions as to what the Kolchak coup d'etat in essence meant. He publicly declared, 'The change of government has killed our soldiers. They say that for years they have been fighting for democracy, and now that the dictator rules at Omsk, they are no longer fighting for democracy. Since the armistice, all the soldiers want to go home to fight the Germans and Magyars in their own country rather than fight the Russians.'" Unquote. The Czechoslovaks were told that they'd received transportation away from Russia, but once they had started their revolt against the Soviets, the British and French did not give them the transports, making all kinds of excuses. Thus, the Czechoslovak troops were effectively trapped in Russia. Then the Entente began telling the Czechoslovak leaders that the Entente will not recognize Czechoslovakia's independence unless they join in the anti-Soviet war. As a result, the Czechoslovak National Council in New York published the following official and dishonest declaration. Quote, "The question, however, of staying in Russia or getting out does not depend on the Czechoslovaks alone. That is something which must be decided by the Allies. The Czechoslovak army is one of the Allied armies, and it is as much under the orders of the Versailles War Council as the French or American army. No doubt the Czechoslovak boys in Russia are anxious to avoid participation in possible civil war in Russia, but they realize at the same time that by staying where they are, they may be able to render far greater services both to Russia and the Allied cause than if they were transported to France. They are at the orders of the Supreme War Council of the Allies." Unquote. This was not at all what the Czechoslovak soldiers had been promised from the beginning, but now they were basically trapped in this conflict. However, the imperialists and the White Guards were able to use the Czechoslovak troops to significant effect. With the support of the Czechoslovak troops and the British, French, and later Japanese and American invasion troops, the Mensheviks and Right-SRs also created their own regimes in some places in Siberia. Victor Serge writes, quote, "The SR Constituent Assembly Committee, known as the Komuch, assumed power in the towns of the Volga following the train of the Czechoslovaks. Each town became, as it was captured, the scene of a protracted massacre of communists and suspects." Unquote. And capitalist historian Pereira writes that, quote, The chief political beneficiary of the Czechoslovak involvement undoubtedly was the SR party, specifically its Siberian regional affiliates. In Novonikolaievsk, 4 Tomsk SRs declared themselves the West Siberian Commissariat of the Provisional Siberian Government, which had been created by the SRD at its January meeting. On 8th to 9th of May, the Czechs also participated in the establishment of the SR Committee of the Members of the Constituent Assembly, or Komuch, in Samara. The Czechs' role in these developments was pivotal. Without their help, the Siberian and Ural anti-Bolshevik forces stood little chance of success." Unquote. The Menshevik-SR bourgeois democratic White Guard government in Siberia suffered from many weaknesses, but as Pereira says, it suffered most importantly from insufficient popular support. Unquote. Again, the supposed great popularity of the right SR and Menshevik bloc, which Brovkin talks about, is completely missing, especially support for Mensheviks, who were only a relatively minor player in all of these ventures. The right SRs were quite conscious that they didn't have any popularity and needed foreign armies to bring them to power. Figes writes that, quote, "Unless," declared Klimushkin, one of the SR leaders in Samara, at the start of May, "there is a spur from the outside in the near future, we can give up all hopes of a coup d'etat." Unquote. And right SR members of this Komuch government later wrote, quote, "The coup we carried out was not supported by the workers." Unquote. Figes also writes that under the Komuch, quote, "The Soviets, as class organs, were barred from politics. The workers rejected the Komuch as bourgeois and passed defiantly Bolshevik resolutions in the Soviet. The factory committees were stripped of their powers and control of the factories was transferred to their former owners. The banks were returned to private control, free trade was restored, and a Council of Trade and Industry, dominated by industrialists, that is, capitalists, was set up to help formulate economic policy." Unquote. This might be a little confusing because the Whites created so many different governments, which then later merged into Siberian provisional government. So in Omsk there was a SR provisional government, in Samara there was the SR Menshevik capitalist Komuch government. With the help of Czechoslovak troops, a right SR provisional Siberian government was also created in Tomsk. There's literally 2 governments that are both called the Siberian Provisional Government, and one is in Tomsk and the other is in Omsk, so I know it's confusing. There was also a White Guard capitalist government created in Harbin called the Business Cabinet, led by General Horvat. Harbin is near the Chinese border. It's actually on the Chinese side of the border, but it was like a Russian military base, I think, so there were a lot of Russians there. Pereira writes, quote, "Without any mass constituency, both Derber, who was the head of the Siberian Provisional Government, and Horvat were obliged to seek legitimation from foreigners, the former in the West and the latter in Japan." Unquote. So he says neither one of these governments had any popular support. The Siberian Provisional Government wanted support from the USA, whereas the so-called Business Cabinet wanted to become a Japanese puppet. The Japanese supported also another white general in Siberia called Ataman Semyonov. They provided him with weapons and 3 million rubles. None of the White Guard regimes had any native support. They all relied exclusively on foreign imperialist backing. Pereira writes the following, quote, "An archetypal scene in this Eastern Siberian comedy occurred when the unsavory Ataman Semyonov, with his multinational crew of cutthroats who had been terrorizing Transbaikal, traveled to the United States to seek American approbation. Even Semyonov understood that, quote, to get the support of the Allies, which was as necessary for any white government as air, required masquerading as a civil democratic regime," unquote. Semyonov was a Cossack chief, and even though he was a white general, a lot of historians describe his military unit basically as a gang of bandits. A Soviet historian, Panferov, writes, quote, "In the meantime, another tool of the Japanese was organizing a White Guard uprising in the city of Blagoveshensk. This was Ataman Gamov. He was assisted by the Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, and the Japanese spies," unquote. Victor Serge writes that in all these places where the SRs, Mensheviks, and other anti-Bolshevik forces came to power, quote, "the old municipal institutions were born again, the bourgeois newspapers reappeared with their announcements of the flight of Trotsky, the Allies' irresistible intervention, the atrocities of the Chinese, Lets, and Germans who made up the Red Army. In other words, just complete lies. They claimed that Trotsky was fleeing the country, that the Bolshevik government had collapsed, that the intervention of the Allies was incredibly successful and that the Bolsheviks were basically screwed, that the Red Army consisted only of Latvians and Lithuanians and Chinese and Germans, which is just ridiculous. I mean, even these days, historians sometimes overstate the influence of the Latvians in the Red Army, but it's honestly pretty funny. If you read books by eyewitnesses to Soviet Russia, I think it was H.G. Wells, for instance, who said that when he went to meet Lenin and interview Lenin for the first time, he noticed that there were no Chinese around. He was like, where's all the Chinese? I thought the Red Army and all of Lenin's guys were all supposed to be Chinese mercenaries or something, because there was no accurate information available at the time, I suppose. Capitalist historian Smith writes, quote, Komuch propagandists made claims that the SRs themselves no doubt knew to be mendacious, as when Komuch's chief propaganda agency, the Department of Agitation, Culture and Propaganda, claimed that Germans made up half of the advancing Red Army, unquote. The SR government in Tomsk reversed the nationalization and stripped the Soviets of power, while another provisional Siberian government in Omsk, led by Vologodsky, quote, abolished the Soviets, immediately reintroduced free trade, denationalized industry, while restricting the activity of trade unions and returned private estates to their original proprietors. In the name of law and order, Cossack punitive expeditions were used to crush peasants and worker organizations, especially the Bolshevik-dominated trade unions, unquote. So much for protecting the Soviets from Bolshevik tyranny, so much for protecting civil liberties and, all that stuff. The Komuch government was the most liberal out of all of these and the most democratic, but that's not saying much. The Komuch government didn't fare any better. As a result of introducing the policy of free trade, as Figes writes, quote, the peasants reduced their food sales to the cities as money lost its value, forcing the Komuch to introduce bread rationing. Its urban base collapsed even further, unquote. As a result, the Komuch soon started carrying out forced requisitioning of food from the peasants, which then sparked peasant resistance. In other words, the Komuch experienced all the same problems as the Bolsheviks did. The Komuch liberals had always claimed that all the food problems were caused only by Bolshevik policies, and that free trade would solve everything, but clearly not. All these White Guard governments, including the Mensheviks as well, they all advocated free trade, but practically always when they came to power, they themselves couldn't even implement free trade because it was just so unworkable in these conditions. The whole point of the SR-Menshevik Komuch government was to restore the capitalist parliament, the constituent assembly. That's why they didn't even call themselves a government, they just called themselves a committee for the constituent assembly. But unfortunately for them, the masses really were not interested in the constituent assembly. Figes writes, quote, through the village and volost Soviets, the peasants were already carrying out their own revolution on the land, and they did not need the sanction of a decree by the Constituent Assembly to complete this. The right SRs could not understand this fundamental fact, that the autonomy of the peasants through their village Soviets had, from their point of view, reduced the significance of any national parliament. To be sure, out of habit or deference to the village elders, the mass of the peasants would cast their votes for the SRs in the elections to the Constituent Assembly, which happened earlier, but very few were prepared to fight the SR battle for its restoration, as the dismal failure of the Komuch would prove in the summer of 1918. Virtually all the resolutions from the villages on this question made it clear that they did not want the assembly to be restored as the political master of the Russian land. As Sokolov later acknowledged from his experience as an SR propagandist in the army, the Constituent Assembly was something totally unknown and unclear to the mass of the frontline soldiers. It was without a doubt a terra incognita. Their sympathies were clearly with the Soviets. These were the institutions that were near and dear to them, reminding them of their own village assemblies. More than once had occasion to hear the soldiers, sometimes even the most intelligent of them, object to the Constituent Assembly. To most of them it was associated with the State Duma, an institution that was remote to them. What do we need some Constituent Assembly for when we already have our Soviets? Despite the SR's expectations, the Volga peasantry proved no more supportive of their government. Had the SRs been willing to support the peasant revolution, things might have been different. But that would have meant recognizing the peasant Soviets, and the Komuch leaders were not prepared to go that far. The Komuch was equally reluctant to sanction the peasants' seizures of the gentry's land. a subsequent decree passed on 22nd of July enabled the former landowners to reclaim any winter fields which they had sown. This in effect meant reversing 1/3 of the peasant requisition of arable land. Troops often had to be called in to enforce the decree. The local squires saw the decree as a license to take the land into their own hands. With the help of an army brigade or their own private militia, they would seize back their property. Sometimes they even had the peasant leaders flogged in public to teach them a lesson, unquote. Capitalist historian Vera writes, quote, "Outwardly, the Omsk Provisional Siberian government remained an amalgam of moderate socialists, non-party regionalists, and liberal nationalists. But by the summer of 1918, its most important figures, Mikhailov, Guins, and Vologodsky, had become de facto cadets," unquote. That is, liberal monarchist capitalists. These people were supposed to be socialists, Mensheviks and SRs, but they had become de facto cadets. He continues that, on the other hand, having lost all popular support, quote, "the cadets grew disenchanted with liberal democracy. One option was to renounce its liberalism, another was to find an alternative constituency as a surrogate for the black, that is, uninformed masses. The cadet leadership, after some divisive flirtation with the third German gambit, merged the first two," unquote. The German gambit is referring to the fact that a lot of the cadets, especially their leader Milyukov, wanted to ally with the Germans. Pereira continues, quote, "The right SRs welcomed the cadet incursion. After the fiasco of the Constituent Assembly, they were increasingly prepared to sacrifice parliamentary niceties and party identity in order to regain the power which they had lost to the Bolsheviks, even at the risk of civil war," unquote. So what that all means is that they all start moving towards military dictatorship. A local person stated that in Samara, during the counter-revolution, quote, "When the Czechs had taken our town, there was a Te Deum in the principal church, and thanks were offered up to God because the country had been rid of a vile enemy, which enemy, the people said, they had elected to govern them, that is the Bolsheviks. It is true that there was not perfect freedom under the Bolsheviks, but in the welter of ideas in which we all lived, the restraints were not very obvious, and though there was a censorship of the telegraph and to some extent of the press up to the time of the Czech outbreak, we were conscious more of the influence of public opinion than of political pressure put upon us by any one party. Under the new regime instituted behind the screen of the Czech forces, we were conscious of the pressure of one political party, and we noted the suppression of the influence of public opinion. In the town of Buzuluk, we saw the Cossacks driving through the streets with a cartload of headless bodies, the peasants remarking, "Those bodies were our sons, they joined the Red Guard to defend the revolution." The next day, while the Cossacks were patrolling the town, a so-called election was held on a limited franchise, and candidates for office were required to have 10 signatures on their papers of certain persons who had held office under the old regime, that is the Tsarist regime. A council was thus elected which bore a close resemblance to that which had existed in 1916, the comment of the people on the street being, "This is too reactionary for us," unquote. Brovkin claims the supposedly socialist SR-Menshevik government of Komuch in Samara represented true democracy, and that it even created its own armed force, which supposedly posed a serious threat to the Bolsheviks. He's saying this because he wants to put forward this narrative that the Mensheviks and SRs were some kind of third force, some kind of liberal democratic alternative between the monarchist whites and the communist reds, but in reality, as Pereira writes, quote, "The Komuch could not count on its own so-called People's Army. Many of the latter's officers openly preferred the political system and military organization of the more authoritarian Omsk regime," unquote. Komuch first called on the people to volunteer for the army, but since only very few people volunteered, they needed to implement conscription. And Figes writes that, quote, "Of all the Komuch's policies, none was more unpopular than the call-up for the People's Army. In any civil war, the success of the contenders depends on their relative abilities to mobilize the local population. This test the Komuch failed in no uncertain fashion," unquote. And, quote, "Colonel Galkin, a typical military bureaucrat of the Tsarist era, was placed in charge of the People's Army. His headquarters became a stronghold of rightist and monarchist officers. Many of them were the sons of local squires and sometimes wreaked a violent revenge on the villages that had seized their families' estates. No wonder the peasants were not keen on the so-called People's Army, unquote. The White-SR writers themselves write the following, quote, "The Komuch army was organized according to the old principles on the same basis as the pre-revolutionary Tsarist army. Galkin, manager of the military department, did absolutely nothing in this regard to democratize the officer corps called upon to organize the People's Army. From the very first day, mutual disagreements began between the officers and the soldiers. Misunderstanding and dissatisfaction, soldiers afraid of everything old, did not trust the officers, and the officers did not trust the soldiers," unquote. And that is of course because during the February Revolution, the soldiers themselves had overthrown the Tsarist police and had overthrown the Tsarist officers, but now the Tsarist officers were being brought back by the SRs and Mensheviks and capitalists. So, remembering what happened in February 1917, the officers thought the soldiers might rebel and kill them at any moment, while the soldiers thought, holy crap, these officers are all monarchists, they all want to restore the Tsar. People didn't want to join the Komuch army and tried to escape from it, and in response the Komuch used similar tactics to the Tsarist counter-revolution of 1906. Figes writes, quote, "The Komuch tried to stem the desertions by sending punitive Cossack detachments into the villages. Military courts, reminiscent of Stolypin's notorious tribunals in 1905-6, were given sweeping powers to punish the deserters and their families. Peasant leaders were publicly flogged and hanged, hostages were taken to force the deserters out of hiding, and whole villages were burned to the ground when soldiers failed to give themselves up. To the peasants, all this must have seemed like a return of the old regime with a vengeance. The effects of repression were merely to strengthen the peasant resistance and drive many of them into the arms of the Reds. Villagers formed brigades, often organized by the Soviet, in order to resist the People's Army and its punitive detachments. These village armies went to war with rusty guns, pitchforks and axes, and odd pieces of artillery mounted on peasant carts. Some fought as partisan units along the Red Army and later became regular detachments of it. The Domashki village brigade was a classic example. It fought against the Cossacks on the southern steppelands of Samara before becoming the nucleus of the 219th Domashki Rifle Division, a regular detachment of the 4th Red Army. The Pugache, Novozhensk, Krasnokutsk, and Kurilovo regiments had similar origins." Unquote. Capitalist historian Rowley writes that the Komuch, quote, "failed to arouse any popular enthusiasm, failed to win over the workers, and ignored the peasants," unquote. And Figes writes, quote, "In the towns, the Komuch encountered opposition from the factory workers. It was unable to maintain control without repressions and arrests, and it was forced to abuse the very political liberties which it had proclaimed on coming to power. In the country areas, the government was unable from the outset to extend its influence by democratic means. Because of the chronic shortage of reliable rural officials, the higher authorities were forced to depend upon provincial and district plenipotentiaries, who were given special powers under martial law to enforce all government orders, to remove officials from office, to break up public meetings, and to arrest suspected Bolsheviks. A good illustration of the situation is in the village of Pestrovka, Nikolaevsk Uest, where the Soviet had remained in power after the establishment of the Komuch. 2 army officers who were sent in to condemn the Soviet at a village gathering on 21st of July were subjected by the peasants to vigilante justice and then brutally murdered. A complete brigade of the People's Army later arrived from Samara to substitute a zemstvo for the Soviet. After the departure of the brigade, however, the peasants disbanded the zemstvo and elected a new Soviet. In the village of Natalin, in Buguruslan Uest, a Cossack detachment flogged not only the relatives of the deserters, but also the leaders of the peasant commune who had organized the seizure of the gentry estate, a brutal act of repression deliberately designed to break the spirit of the defiant peasants, and highly reminiscent of the gentry reaction of 1906-7. In the village of Dmitrivka, in the Orenburg region, another Cossack detachment flogged all the men of the village as a punishment for the division of the gentry land. Over a period of 3 weeks, 100 peasants were given a total of nearly 4,000 lashes." Unquote. And Smith writes, quote, "Peasants complained that the Komuch People's Army made impossible carting demands, and that they got the whip when they asked for documents legitimizing the army's requests or objected in any way. Army units seized geese, ducks, and grain and did not pay for them, or paid too low a price, They took horses and refused to provide receipts, and everywhere they beat up village elders and other peasants when the villagers did not satisfy their demands. In some villages, peasants resisted violently, attacking requisitioning detachments and the punitive detachments sent out in their wake. At a peasants' congress in Samara in September, many speakers reported on the extraordinary situation that had developed on the ground in connection with requisitioning. A sympathetic reporter summarized their stories. Arrests, executions, and all sorts of measures of retribution have become so common that the peasant population is literally terrorized. The People's Army became almost universally unpopular in the Russian villages of Samara and Ufa provinces." Unquote. And the Soviet historian Medvedev writes what has already been corroborated by other sources, quote, "The peasants did not want to fight the Soviet troops. At military headquarters, 2nd Lieutenant Gorbachev, member of the Propaganda Bureau for recruiting soldiers into the People's Army, reported that the peasant residents of the village of Osorgin, Oviato Dukovskoye lost, speaking at a meeting in favor of the policy of the Bolsheviks, declared, 'All frontline soldiers are Bolsheviks, and we stand for Soviet power. Bolsheviks have done nothing bad to us. We don't want any other power. This one is good for us. We voted for the Bolsheviks, and the entire front voted for them. And who elected these members of the Constituent Assembly, we do not know.' 2nd Lieutenant Gorbachev advised sending a detachment to Osorgino that would take the new recruits, take away their weapons, and restore the Zemstvo. But such detachments, against the advice of 2nd Lieutenant Gorbachev, traveled around the province and committed terrible atrocities." Unquote. And Smith writes, quote, "Peasants reacted extremely hostilely to the first visit by an agitator to inform them of the draft by Komuch. The peasants proclaimed in chorus that the Bolsheviks had not carried out a mobilization, and a mobilization now would only serve to help the bourgeois confiscate the land. Agitators reported that peasants in these volosts openly declared their support for Soviet power, as the authorities tried in vain to push through the mobilization." Unquote. The only reliable forces that the Whites had, besides maybe some foreign armies, had been Cossacks, who were a privileged soldier caste kept separated from the Russian people. To keep the Cossacks separate from the rest of the population and to give them a sense of superiority, there was even an attempt to fabricate a separate racial identity for the Cossacks, claiming that they were some kind of superior race. So because the Cossacks were relatively more reliable to the Whites, that is why the first White armies and first White rebellions were organized in the Cossack regions. The army of Krasnov on the Don. White generals Kornilov and Semenov were also Cossack chiefs. However, even among the Cossacks, only the richest Cossacks were firm supporters of the Whites. Figes writes, quote, "The younger and war-weary Cossacks from the front, influenced by the officers risen from their ranks, were more inclined to find some accord with the Bolsheviks than to fight against them. Thus, it was only in the southern Don, where the Cossacks were more wealthy and more determined to defend their historic landed privileges against the demands of the Russian peasants for land reform, that the Cossacks were prepared to fight the Bolsheviks." Unquote. And he further says that during the Civil War there was a, quote, "wave of Cossack uprisings against Bolshevism started in the villages near Novoscherkassk. These had always been the richest in the Don." Unquote. So again, we can clearly see the socio-economic factors, class relations, playing the most important role in determining people's behavior as working Cossacks turned against the Whites and joined the Bolsheviks. The SRs and Mensheviks protested against some crimes committed by the monarchist White Guards, but these complaints were always totally ignored. A good demonstration of how little support the SRs and Mensheviks must have had is that they never even considered relying on the population, relying on the people. They considered that their only option to challenge the monarchists was either to ask help from the Czechs or to ask help from the Western imperialist forces, though the imperialists didn't listen to such arguments and increasingly switched their support to the monarchists. Pereira writes, quote, "SR protests seemed perfunctory, as if by then everybody understood that there was nothing to be accomplished by verbal denunciations of even the most gross violations of civil rights. Some thought was given to asking the Czechs for military assistance against Omsk, but that was dismissed too as divisive and risky. The one remaining hope was that the Allies would insist upon a reckoning or at least fair play for democratic forces." Unquote. Quote, "An authoritarian tone was originally set by the influential Omsk bloc, made up of big merchants and industrialists, members of the liberal professions, civil servants, some military officers, and cadets, which made clear its preference for a unipersonal military dictatorship. This was not a new idea in conservative circles. General Kornilov had enjoyed the support of many of the same people and interest groups for his coup attempt in September 1917, unquote. In all these coalitions, the right SRs, and especially the Mensheviks, were always the smallest and weakest party, despite the fact that the capitalist cadet party, not to mention the monarchists, also had extremely low popularity among the people, as was consistently shown in all elections. That says something about the low level of support for the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks had always insisted that they need to collaborate with the cadets, but the cadets were increasingly becoming even more reactionary than they had ever been before. Pereira writes, quote, "The Socialist Revolutionary Party lost control to the cadets, while the latter traded liberalism for a neo-idealist, romantic, nationalist vision of a state power infused with the cult of the army," unquote. According to Brovkin himself, the capitalist liberal cadet party, quote, "the party of the people's liberty," as it called itself, refused to condemn anti-Jewish pogroms on liberated territory. Russian liberals ended up in the company of the Black Hundreds, unquote. Victor Serge writes, quote, "What were the social forces on which the Constituent Assembly, Committee, or the Komuch relied? The Menshevik Maisky, a former member of this government of democratic counter-revolution, has drawn a precise portrait on this point. The hostility of the working class towards the committee was so great that the latter's attempt to create a docile Soviet with Menshevik assistance collapsed miserably, with the Soviet promptly passing a Bolshevik resolution. Mobilization was a dismal failure in the countryside," unquote. And Rickman, who was an eyewitness and member of the Red Cross who was traveling with the Czechoslovak region, writes, quote, "Districts which had tried both the Bolshevik regime and that set up under the Czechs, when free to do so, reverted to Bolshevism. The Czechs were forced to retire from the Volga to the Urals because of uprisings among the people. The Soviet of Vladivostok was returned at the July elections, though the Reds were in prison. I'll talk about that more later. From the Urals to the eastern coast, the people were discontented with the Directorate and the dictatorship and preferred a return to the Soviets," unquote. The Czechoslovaks occupied at least the towns of Chelyabinsk, Penza, Sizren, Novonikolaevsk, Samara, Ufa, Kazan, Simbirsk, Verkhne Uralsk, Zlatoust, and Ekaterinburg. And according to Rickman, the people in all these places supported the Bolsheviks and voted for the Bolsheviks if elections were allowed to be held. The sources I've provided consistently note that the Mensheviks and SRs and White Guards had no popular support at all in Siberia. The Samara Soviet passed a Bolshevik resolution calling for the arming of all workers, restoration of Soviet power and all Soviet laws. As Smith writes, quote, "Unnerved by the prospect of a Bolshevik majority in the Soviet, Gendelman editorialized somberly in the Samara SR organ Zemlya Volya, there is no reason to repeat old mistakes. The Soviets no longer assure unified action, since the Bolsheviks are tolerated in their midst. We cannot march together with people who advance slogans about fighting for an unrealizable socialist revolution by unacceptable means that infringe on democracy. We cannot march with people who in the final accounting have betrayed the cause of the working class. They must be isolated. We must abandon the Soviets and build new non-party political associations of the working class that stand for a platform of class struggle and popular sovereignty," unquote. As Medvedev writes, quote, "As a result, many Soviet delegates were arrested and the White Terror intensified," unquote. According to Menshevik writer David Dallin, the Samara Soviet with its Bolshevik majority was disbanded by the Mensheviks and the Whites. A worker conference was held in the Komuch territory in June 1918. Quote, "In a situation of terror, supporters of the Soviet government were unable to put forward their candidates. The election results were rigged, but despite this the Mensheviks and SRs faced serious opposition at the conference. Of the 80 mandates read out, only 28 supported the power of the Komuch," unquote, while the majority didn't dare openly express their view. At this workers' conference, quote, "The Mensheviks suffered losses and failure, although its composition was selected by the Mensheviks in advance. The majority of workers were hostile to Komuch in all the cities of the Middle Volga region." The conference was the scene of heated discussions. On June 22nd, the secret police arrested conference participants Romanov and Elkin. Delegate M. Orlov was arrested for agitation against the war with the Bolsheviks and was brought before a military court. S.R. Lebedev at the meeting of the conference on July 15th threatened, "Those who remain at the meeting and do not want to go along with us, I warn my friends on the other side of the front, we are not joking. With an iron hand we will force you to submit, and those who persist will be mercilessly destroyed by us." Unquote. Before the Czechoslovak and White Guard invasion, quote, "In the general mass of provincial congresses of Soviets in the Middle Volga region in the spring of 1918, communists made up more than half, more than 52%. The remaining part of the mandates was allocated to non-party members, 23%, less than a fifth, 17% were left-wing SR, and less than one-tenth, 7.7%, are representatives of the right SR, Mensheviks and other petty bourgeois parties. Communists and sympathizers of the Bolsheviks made up 70% of the members of the provincial executive committees. The district Soviets were also mostly Bolshevik." Unquote. The population of Siberia resisted the Menshevik, Right SR, White Guard and imperialist forces ferociously. Quote, "During the last 6 months, Siberia has been aflame with revolutionary uprisings. Since October 1918, a long series of peasant revolts has swept western and eastern Siberia, embracing the provinces of Altai, Akmolinsk, Tomsk, Yeniseisk, and Irkutsk. The uprisings bore the broad character of mass action, involving not merely townships but entire Siberian districts extending vast areas. Volunteer detachments had been organized in the course of fighting and had become closely bound together. Red volunteers have assumed leadership in the guerrilla warfare commenced by the people. Red forces have succeeded in establishing an almost uninterrupted front between the station of Kamarchaga, 80 versts east of Krasnoyarsk, and the station of Nizhneudinsk, a front of over 200 miles. Backed by the sympathies of the peasant population of that district, the Red volunteers have during the present year gathered a considerable force. There were also many cases of open desertion of the mobilized Kolchak troops to the side of the Red volunteers. Kolchak and the Allied command have thrown large forces into that district. 2 Czech divisions have also been sent there. But the Czechs have long ago lost their desire to fight, and the command itself does not put much confidence in them, endeavoring to bring up the more reliable Japanese soldiers." Unquote. This statement very closely agrees with Figes and the various capitalist sources as well. A writer named Zipin writes, "Red guerrillas had dealt devastating blows to the whites in Siberia. Quote, when the Red Army entered a city or a village in Siberia, or else took possession of a part of the railroad, it found the ground prepared and the road ready for its coming. It was always met by a population not only friendly but enthusiastic and impatiently waiting for it." Unquote. A proclamation of the Siberian Red guerrillas says, quote, "Comrades, the foreign bands, in collusion with our thickheads and hangmen, have throttled our October Revolution here in Siberia and have overthrown our people's government. The enemies of the working masses, the enemies of our revolution and the Soviet Republic, the friends and the sons of the bourgeois elements in alliance with the soft-bodied traitors, the Mensheviki and the Socialist revolutionists, are robbing us of all the freedom and rights that we have won by our blood and for which the Russian working class has striven for long generations. They are reviving the old order that the parasites, the manufacturers, the landowners and the Tsarist officers may again live in luxury. They are returning to the village exploiters the land that they robbed from the peasants, and to the officers their golden braid and high pay. Our enemies are destroying our revolutionary order, our acquired rights, together with the land riches that the workers, peasants and Cossacks have created by much labor and endurance. Let us, therefore, all of us, revolt as one man against them, and let our battle cry be, down with the exploiters." Unquote. To the Red guerrillas, only volunteers recommended by 3 trusted comrades are accepted, and, quote, "there is a uniform decision by the local Reds that the revolutionary staffs under no circumstances shall expropriate the poor or even middle peasants." Unquote. Their sources of weapons and resources was mostly by simply expropriating from the Kolchak forces. The Associated Press wrote that, quote, "According to well-informed circles, the Siberian armies were demoralized under Bolshevik propaganda, and due to the long retreat, the men did not desire to fight. Their officers did not dare to give battle under the circumstances. Because of desertions, the armies have dwindled to mere skeletons. Several units have been killed, and some of the officers have gone over to the Bolsheviki." Unquote. Quote, one would suppose that in the villages the social revolutionists with their mission of democracy and the great words of the Constituent Assembly on their lips have more luck. Not so. In the villages, as in the cities, it is the local Reds that dominate and whose propaganda is supreme. The Ruskaya Rech of Novonikolayevsk, a capitalist newspaper, tells of a whole series of villages where the peasants refused to pay taxes to the white government as well as to the zemstvos. In the village of Novotroitsky, county of Bakinsk, the peasants held a meeting and the following shortest resolution on record. Taxes we will not pay and you can't do anything to us. The collector sent out a hurry call for a punitive expedition, but no punitive expedition dared approach this village. The above Kolchak organ takes rather needless pains to prove that it is all the work of the horrible Bolsheviki. In the villages of Isakovskaya, Zuralevskaya, Moskovskaya, Tulskaya, the paper adds, the Bolsheviki have actually all the peasants with them and have organized them for resistance. Unquote. Quote, there's a confession of one of the zemstvo workers that went to the villages to carry to them the great tidings of the organization of the SR-Menshevik-Siberian Committee. It was in the Amur region where he intended to work, and his experiences are related in the Rabotnik of Blagoveshchensk, one of those little struggling Bolshevist organs that appear and disappear again under the nose of the watchful Allied commanders and their allies, the Semyonovs and Kalmykovs. It says, almost all the young men in the villages have left for the Bolshevist fronts, and there remain only some old folks and children, and it is remarkable how even the old pious peasants are supporting the Soviets. They are not at all convinced that their sons have acted right in leaving for the numerous Red fronts. They are not at all sure that this action is in accordance with their religion and their old beliefs. But it is their own sons, their own blood, and right or wrong, they cannot help siding with them. But while their feeling towards the Bolsheviki is somewhat hazy, their hatred towards Kolchak is both open and outspoken, and their hostility towards zemstvos and all the other so-called democratic organizations is even more glaring. Often our workers were attacked bodily by the old villagers who blamed all the troubles on us. Why don't you let our sons alone? Why do you come to aggravate us in our pain? It is enough that we have two fighting sides, and there you go with a new one, were interrogations and explanations that were hurled at our workers from all sides at the meetings. One of our workers was nearly torn to pieces because he had chosen to make an insulting remark about one of the leaders of one of the villages, one who had since gone to the Red Front. Grishka was his name, and the zemstvo instructor tried to belittle him, telling the peasants that Grishka was, after all, only an illiterate. A wonderful cry of anger came from all sides. They have known Grishka since childhood, and they can all vouch for his honesty. Besides, if he was unimportant as you say, came from one of the audience, how is it that the Americans, the Japanese, the English, the French, and all the world are after Grishka? One had to hear the outburst of the peasants. They are actually proud that one of theirs has become so important a figure as to have the whole world of governments after him. The relator tried to organize the remaining few into a local of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, but he was nearly stoned. They wouldn't hear of any other party but the Bolshevik, or rather the Soviet Party. They openly lay all the blame for their plight at the door of the Socialist Revolutionists and the zemstvos. Weren't these parties once supporting Kolchak and the Allies? Not a kopeck would they pay for the so-called democratic organizations, surely nothing to the tax collectors. But the secret emissaries of the local Reds that come in the nights are fed with the peasants' last crumbs. Unquote. Even after Kolchak's government was defeated, he tried to organize a new government in the Far East, which still masqueraded as supposedly compatible with socialism, supported by Mensheviks, SRs, etc. Quote, Kolchak may instruct his new premier to organize a new cabinet with the greatest possible socialistic tendencies, compatible with Kolchak's stand against Bolshevism, as the Associated Press tells us, but it is clearly the island of Sakhalin, whither he is heading, where he may organize that so-called socialistic cabinet, with men like Cherven Vadali as the managers of whose activities, as well as of the so-called National Center, that is, the capitalist cadet government that he represents. Unquote. Panferov writes that in Irkutsk, Mensheviks and right SRs with the support of the Czechoslovak troops set up a government, the so-called political center, quote, which was just another disguise for a bourgeois government, but their plans came to grief. the insurgent workers of Irkutsk routed Semyonov's men and other white forces, set up a revolutionary committee and dispersed the political center. Irkutsk triumphantly met the victorious regiments of the Red Army." Unquote. In Vladivostok, the underground Bolsheviks organized a general strike of workers which paralyzed the city on January 3, 1920. In the description I will put a link to the script that I'm using for this, and in the script there are some additional sources if you wanna check those out. For example, about these strikes. On January 26, 1920, the workers of Nikolsk-Uzyursk revolted, the White Guard troops mutinied and joined the Reds. The Red partisans came to reinforce the rebellion, and the city again established Soviet power under the Bolsheviks. Viscount Yasuo Yoshida, former Japanese ambassador at Washington, who on his return here from his post as ambassador to Russia, expressed doubt as to the wisdom of entering Siberia at this time. His conviction was that Bolshevism today represented the thought of a great majority of Russian people. Unquote. In 1920, the Japanese had to begin evacuating their troops from Russia. The White General Semyonov begged the Japanese not to leave, but the Japanese replied to his request in the following way, quote, "The Imperial Japanese government have discussed your request from every angle. They are grateful to you and wish to maintain friendly relations, but the situation, which is embarrassing us from every side, does not permit us to accede to your request. Furthermore, the Japanese government do not consider you strong enough to help Japan in the achievement of her great aims. Your influence among the Russian people is waning day by day, and the hatred which the Russians entertain for you is affecting our policy." Unquote. According to capitalist historian Vera, quote, "Semenov himself, along with Kalmykov and the remnants of their forces, crossed the frontier into Manchuria in 1921 and entered the direct employ of the Japanese Secret Service." Unquote. And that was pretty much the end of him. So does it seem like the Mensheviks and SRs had a lot of popularity in Siberia either? I mean, that was where their strongest base was. But no, it doesn't really look like it. Lastly, let's talk about Vladivostok. Brovkin doesn't talk about Vladivostok because he only talks about provincial capitals in European Russia, but not in a bunch of places that he lists out, and also he doesn't discuss Petrograd or Moscow. But he doesn't talk about Vladivostok either because Vladivostok is not in European Russia. But Vladivostok is an illustrative case, so let's take a look. So Vladivostok was another Soviet city which the imperialists invaded very early on. Already in January 1918, the Japanese cruisers Ivanti, Asahi, the British HMS Suffolk, and the American cruiser Brooklyn arrived in the waters before Vladivostok. The Japanese then said that they wanted to intervene in the city in order to protect their own citizens. The Mensheviks and Right SRs in the local municipal Duma supported this demand of the Japanese. There's a footnote in Lenin's collected works which says that, quote, "On March 29, 1918, the Menshevik Socialist Revolutionary Municipal Council fell in with the wishes of the Japanese military by declaring itself unable to maintain order in Vladivostok." Unquote. All the capitalist historians pretty much agree with this statement, but I just quoted from this footnote because it has the actual date. According to Panfarov, the Japanese invaded Vladivostok to protect Japanese citizens on April 4th, 1918, and, quote, "The treacherous Municipal Council of Vladivostok, which was controlled by the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries, upheld the actions of the Japanese," unquote. At first, the Japanese did not commit any armed acts and didn't really intervene, but when the Czechoslovak troops arrived, the Japanese and all the other imperialists attacked the local communists. According to bourgeois writer Rickman, quote, "The political situation in Vladivostok caused the greatest anxiety to all parties. In the early morning of July 3rd, the Czechs attacked the town from the surrounding hills and drove the Bolsheviks into the central square. At that moment, the Bolsheviks were surprised by machine gun fire from the roof of the British consulate. HMS Suffolk having contributed the guns, we heard also the men. The Bolsheviks regarded this as an act of war," unquote. And again, this is all done in cahoots with the Mensheviks and SRs, with the help of the Czechoslovak forces as well. The Right SR writers, for instance, in their book, they constantly stress that the Czechoslovaks agree with them politically. and that the Czechoslovaks basically represent some kind of democratic socialism or liberal democracy. A bourgeois observer in the naval city of Vladivostok says that, quote, the sailors are Bolsheviki almost to a man, unquote. The bourgeois writer then says that when traveling in the nearby industrial region, the workers were preparing a sympathy strike to support the Reds of Vladivostok. The White Guards, Czechoslovaks, British and Japanese forces all worked together. Capitalist historians Galton and Keep write that, quote, the Czechs shortly afterwards shot without trial 2 Bolshevik leaders, Suhanov and Melnikov, unquote. And Rickman writes, quote, the Allies and the Czechs took the town, put the Bolshevik civil authorities in prison, and declared that they would give the town a free election without the possibility of Bolshevik coercion. The Bolshevik civil authorities who were in prison were returned at the election, and the Allies and Russians who were cooperating stated that as the men who had been elected were serving their sentences in a prison, a new government would have to be constituted, unquote. So they make this great pretense that, oh yeah, we want to implement liberal democracy because the Bolsheviks are such tyrants, but we're gonna bring real democracy, let's have elections, and then the population elects the Bolsheviks, and they just say, well, they're in prison, so that doesn't count. How dare they complain about any limitations that the Bolsheviks put in place, such as the fact that capitalists and members of the royal family couldn't become electoral candidates, when this is what they themselves do. Max Stripyansky writes, the Siberian Red partisans were able to liberate Vladivostok eventually, but in April 1920 the Japanese heavily bombarded and reoccupied it and arrested the leader of the Revolutionary Committee, Bolshevik Lazo. He was given to the White Guards, who then proceeded to burn him alive. At this point the Czechoslovak troops finally had enough and rebelled against the Whites and joined the side of the Reds. Quote, the entire maritime region from Vladivostok to Pogranichaya and to Khabarovsk, and the region of Amur from Khabarovsk to Sterensk are freed from the rule of Kolchak and from that of the Ottomans. In the Amur region and in Khabarovsk, the Soviet regime has been re-established, unquote. This is from a newspaper article from April 24th of 1920. When the Whites had decisively been defeated in Siberia, the Far Eastern Republic was created, in which the Bolsheviks played a leading role. Even after this, the Japanese and French both brought white troops consisting of Semyonov's forces and also the White-SR Komuch forces, which landed in Vladivostok and established the Merkulov puppet dictatorship. This government proclaimed Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich the new Tsar of all Russia. In 1922, the Japanese were finally forced out of Vladivostok, and the White regime then collapsed with them. No sign of Menshevik or SR popularity. According to Smith, White Czechoslovak commander Gaida, quote, subsequently departed for Czechoslovakia, where he later became the leader of the Czechoslovak fascists during the interwar period, unquote. As told by several sources, including an American Red Cross activist who was present at the time, the Mensheviks and Right-SRs, with their White Guard troops, arrested all the Bolsheviks and forced the Soviets to carry out new elections, but the people still voted for the Bolsheviks, and the result was simply declared invalid by the Mensheviks and Right-SRs because the Bolsheviks were in prison and thus couldn't participate in the Soviets. Even in Khabarovsk, the masses voted for the Bolsheviks, despite it being a military town where apparently Bolshevik popularity was lower than elsewhere. An interview with Gertrude M. Robinson says this, question, how many people do you suppose there were who were opposed to the Soviets before the Allies came? Answer, you mean in Khabarovsk? Well, you see, that city is really an officer city. It was the capital always of the Far East, and all the officials and all the banks and many governmental institutions were there. And of course, all these officers were against it. Out of 50,000 people, perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 would be against the Soviet. All the higher officials were in the beginning against it. They would try to sabotage. Banks would go on strike, the higher teachers too went on strike, but the parents called meetings and compelled them to go back and teach their children. We declared that if they did not go back, they would have to go work in the shops, and so they went back. Question, do you think there was a higher percentage of people against the Soviets there than there was in other cities? Answer, oh yes, because it is an officer city, unquote. I discussed quite a few cities in this video, but I still have election results and other data for many other cities, for example Saratov, which I will discuss in a later episode. Thanks for watching, see you next time. If you want to support me on Patreon, you can find the link to my Patreon in the description. You can also find links to my Discord, my blog, an email where you can message me, etc, etc.